As documented in the previous installment of this Strange Brew series, the concerns about a communist ogre threatening America originally arose around the time of the Russian Revolution. Leaders in government, big business, and the police and military were concerned about European individuals they considered radicals, particularly communists, socialists, and anarchists, coming to America's shores to introduce their radical ideas to industrial workers and other susceptible Americans disillusioned with aspects of American society. This would include, in particular, poorly paid workers in dangerous and exhausting jobs in industries and mines. There were suspicions that the aggressive efforts to unionize American blue-collar workers of all races were being infiltrated by radicals who might attempt to foment a Russian-style workers' revolution. Thus, any time a union group attempted to demonstrate or strike, there was an assumption that they were being agitated to such actions by European infiltrators. There was also a concern in general that the poorest of the American classes could be swept along to revolutionary ideas by the reality of the extreme inequality in the distribution of wealth in the country, just as the peasants in Russia had resented the feudal system under the Tsar. So the primary concern during the first Red Scare, which rose after World War I in 1919, was the thought of an actual armed revolution. And the answer proposed to solve this threat was to round up and deport all foreign radical element. This was the focus of the Palmer raids of 1918 and 19. As one cartoon put it, Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer was seeing a red under every bush. Once this fear was shown to be basically unfounded by the failure of the Palmer raids to reveal some nationwide powerful underground movement of radicals, the Red Scare mostly faded out of national attention. It was replaced in the minds of the middle and upper classes by the relative prosperity and often frivolous nature of American society during the Roaring Twenties. The communist ogre took a decade-long nap, you might say. The prosperous society of the 20s came crashing down with the 1929 stock market crash, the failures of many businesses and banks, and the grinding poverty of many average Americans, exacerbated by the huge droughts of the natural disaster of the Dust Bowl. The previous entry in this series took a look at just one incident in the early 1930s that led to government, big business, and the military once more jump-starting that slumbering ogre to blame for a chaotic confrontation between government and the teeming masses of the poor. In 1932, over 25,000 destitute military veterans of World War I, some with wives and family in tow, converged on Washington, D.C. to demand that the Congress authorize an early payment on a war bonus they had been promised in 1924. The law establishing that promise had been written in a way that the bonus wasn't payable until 1945. But the men and their families were starving now, and they hoped that their presence in Washington in such a mass demonstration of their desperation would prompt Congress to relent. They set up camps around Washington, including one massive Hooverville-style encampment just 2 miles from the Capitol building. But the Congress ultimately refused to give in to their demands, and after a standoff of many weeks, President Hoover sent in federal troops, equipped with everything from tear gas to tanks, to put an end to their efforts and force them to go back where they came from. And throughout it all, Hoover and other government officials, along with much of the national press, insisted that actually the majority of the men weren't even war veterans at all. They were just shiftless tramps and criminals and communists bent on fomenting a revolution against the U.S. government. Later evidence showed that these accusations weren't true, and that there was never any credible threat of a revolution by these destitute men just trying to fend off starvation for themselves and their families. So once again, the communist ogre that represented the threat of a violent overthrow of the American way proved not to be as big and scary as he was painted by those who wanted to use him for an excuse for social and economic strife in the country. Which brings us to the late 1930s. The nature of the ogre had been gradually changing. At this point, the primary concern for many, particularly big business leaders, was more of a concern that communist ideology was beginning to make inroads into the thought processes of some elements of American society. The worry slowly developed that the aspects of communism that questioned and criticized unfettered capitalism might spread in a much more subtle way, and this might eventually result not in a violent revolution, but in a gradual attempt by the citizenry and their representatives to make societal changes that would threaten big business. The representatives of communism who might be part of this spread were no longer the wide-eyed, bushy-bearded, ignorant, anarchistic, bomb-throwing stereotype of the 1919 Red Scare. They might well be respectable-looking, calm, intelligent, well-spoken people who could worm their way into respectable parts of society, including in politics and education. They might be sent from a foreign nation like Russia, but they also might well be homegrown American converts to communism. Early attempts to push back at the possibility of American citizens being calmly persuaded by communist infiltrators to take a hard look at the fruits of unfettered capitalism included advertising campaigns instituted by various groups of businessmen, including the National Association of Manufacturers. They would calmly sell the idea of unfettered capitalism to the general public as being the only way to have a truly prosperous society. Billboards and pamphlets and public service-style motion picture shorts were enlisted in such efforts. At the time these efforts were proving to be not very effective, a new approach to the threat of Americans being sneakily seduced by the promises of communism, of being influenced by persuasive communist infiltrators, whether foreign or homegrown, began slowly developing in certain circles. And that brought us, at the end of the previous Strange Brew installment, to the immediate forerunner of the House Un-American Activities Committee, the HUAC, made famous in the 1950s Red Scare era. It was formed in 1938 under the strong leadership of this man, Martin Dies, a Democratic congressman from Texas. It first functioned under the name Special Committee to Investigate Un-American Activities, often nicknamed the Dies Committee. It was nominally supposed to investigate Nazism and other foreign ideologies, including communism, viewed as a threat to the American way. But in spite of the ominous rise of the power of Hitler and the Nazis in Germany at that point, and the presence of pro-German groups in America actively promoting Nazi interests, the reality is that Dies' committee almost totally focused on communism, and not the threat of a violent communist revolt instigated by wild-eyed radicals stirring up labor union members. No, Dies in particular had an agenda that was far different. He made his agenda clear in his 1940 book titled The Trojan Horse in America. In the book, he laid out the case for viewing communism not as primarily a political movement promoting an economic alternative to capitalism. No, he proposed that communism was something much more insidious. It wasn't a political or even an intellectual theory. It was instead an actual religion designed to function as a rival to Christianity. It required of its followers a complete and total faith in the communist system, as complete and fervent as any faith expected of Protestants or Catholics or Jews. According to Dies, communist representatives didn't want to convince Americans and other citizens around the world to change their system of economics. They wanted to convert them to the complete ideological system of communism, which, he assured the reader, was a system that was totally, in his eyes, based on the complete and utter rejection of any notion of God. A notion not without basis, as you can see from these Soviet anti-religion posters at the time, that mocked all three major religions, from Christian to Jewish to Islam. And thus his answer to how to resist this communist ogre wasn't to use physical weapons of warfare. Since communism was actually a perverted faith, the only way to resist it was with real faith. As Joel Herzog put it in his book, The Spiritual Industrial Complex, for Dies, Judeo-Christianity offered the best possible counter to the grotesque illusion of communism. since it rested on 4 essential moral propositions. God as the grantor of freedom and sustenance, a respect for individuals because they are created in God's image, God is the only basis for a just and peaceful society, and a belief in spiritual rather than material forces. The real answer to the threat of communism, Dies wrote elsewhere in 1938, lies in the restoration of Christian influence in America. The irreconcilable conflict between the teachings of Christ and Marx is the issue upon which the future of Western civilization is staked. Although Dies was one of the earliest governmental figures to propose this new view of communism, and the view of the battle with communism being in the nature of a holy war, many others quickly jumped on the bandwagon. And by the late 1940s, in the lead up to the Second Red Scare, the whole notion was becoming a blueprint for American action. As Herzog writes, simply put, religion became part of the Cold War solution for America's public servants. I offered this brief summary of the progression of the communist ogre because I wanted to get to Dies' list again. I'm pretty sure many viewers, now in the 21st century, noticed something very particular about his comments. They seem to be so contrary to the modern view that many have of the notion of the separation of church and state. Dies implied that the only way for America to be able to fight an alien and godless ideology like communism that might overthrow American civilization is if its citizens understand and agree with those 4 propositions and act thereon. And yet, as we saw in their own words in the last video, leaders like Eisenhower and Truman jumped on this bandwagon and promoted the ideas without the slightest hint that it was a flouting of the constitutional church-state dichotomy. Why do you suppose that is? After all, neither Eisenhower nor Truman was a particularly religious man. They certainly weren't the sort of rabid evangelical Christian types of today who would like to turn America into a theocracy. So I offer you something to think about that I've seldom seen clearly enunciated in any church-state debates or dialogue. I'm used to pro-separation folks taking a firm stand on the conviction that America's founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution are religion neutral. If you look at them in an originalist sense, trying to understand what the framers were saying in light of other things they wrote at the time, and deduce what they were thinking, it seems like you should be able to clearly discern their definition of the word religion as it is used in the First Amendment. So let's notice Dies' first 2 propositions. God as the grantor of freedom and sustenance, a respect for individuals because they are created in God's image. I'm pretty sure most folks would look at these as religious statements, but consider this. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I would guess most folks don't think of these introductory words of the Declaration as being particularly religious statements, because they don't talk about religious laws like the 10 Commandments, they don't mention either Moses or Jesus, they don't invoke the Bible, they don't talk about any sort of church denomination. But have you considered what they actually do say? The authors are stating that the men who signed this document are agreeing that some things are self-evident. If someone declares that something is a self-evident statement, they mean that it does not require any proof. They hold it to be unquestionable and beyond debate. It can be stated without elaborating or defending it. And the first thing that the signers of the Declaration of Independence agreed was self-evident was that a creator exists. Yes, a God, and that he created people, and that those people are all in some sense equal, not because a government declares it, not because they agree among themselves to consider one another equals, but because it is self-evident that God made them that way. Look at the second thing that the signers of the Declaration agreed was self-evident. Those created people are endowed, that means given a gift, by that Creator, and that endowment is a package of rights. Those rights are inalienable, meaning that no person or government can take them away. Not rights that a government decides to grant them, not rights that they agree as a group to allow to be part of the social compact. No, those package of rights were declared by the signers of the Declaration to be the self-evident gift of a God, whom they were convinced existed because it was self-evident to them that he did. And thirdly, among those rights is liberty. Just like Dye said, the signers of the Declaration declared that all men are free because God granted them freedom when he created them. What is going on here? Doesn't the Constitution later, being instituted by many of these same men, say this? Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof? What I'm suggesting to you is just this. There appears to have been a difference in the minds of the authors and signers of the founding documents between a, quote, belief in a supernatural God, quote, and a belief in certain few characteristics he has, such as being the creator of mankind, and being part of a religion. They state clearly that as far as they are concerned, the existence of God is something self-evident. It's not a part of the ideology of a man-made denomination of religion. It just is. And it seems from the evidence that as far as they were concerned, the foundational idea of people having rights and freedom because that God intended it for them was not a religious idea, it just was. Just like the idea of gravity is self-evident. I would suggest the strong possibility to you that when the writers of the Constitution wrote of a, quote, establishment of religion, it meant to them a man-made organization of people with a set of required beliefs and practices. At the time of the American Revolution, the government of England had laws which established the specific Church of England denomination, giving it special status. It was, and still is, specifically referred to as the Established Church of England. King George held the role of the supreme governor of that denomination in 1776, and Queen Elizabeth holds that role today. Other nations had specific laws establishing the Roman Catholic Church as the one approved denomination in the country, with perhaps all other religious groups even outlawed in some lands. The writers of the Constitution insisted this was not going to be so in the U.S. The signers of the Declaration claimed that they were convinced that it was self-evident that there was a creator who made humans and who gave them rights. Well, likely most of them were convinced. I'm sure there were a few radical non-believers who only signed the document because they wanted to go along to get along. But they made it clear in the Constitution that they had no intention of telling anyone how they ought to relate to this self-evident creator. There would be no rules about where you had to worship, how you had to worship, how you had to pray, what rules you had to follow to have favor with that creator, and most certainly no requirement for citizens to be part of any specific denomination. But no such generosity was allowed for atheists. As an article in a 2018 New Yorker magazine titled, "Why Are Americans Still Uncomfortable with Atheism?" put it, although many colonists came to this country seeking to practice their own faith freely, they brought with them a notion of religious liberty that extended only to other religions, often only to other denominations of Christianity. From John Locke, they inherited the idea that atheists cannot be good citizens and should not be brought into the social contract. In a letter concerning toleration, Locke had written, quote, Those are not at all to be tolerated who deny the being of a God." Unquote. Frankly, I don't think the signers of the Declaration and Constitution had the slightest intention to even address the possibility of atheists or how they might fit in this whole scheme of things. It wasn't part of their worldview. The existence of God was self-evident. Case closed. Oh, not that they didn't realize that a few of their contemporaries, including in the colonial leadership, were likely atheists or agnostics, but I'm betting that they just looked on them benignly as eccentric curmudgeons and ignored their idiosyncrasy. Which leaves atheists in later generations in American history right up to the present in a bind, and especially in the era that began with Martin Dies and his communist religion theory. Although Dies himself eventually admitted he didn't consider just believing in a creator enough to be able to mount a defense against communism, later leaders in the early Second Red Scare era were more than happy to put up a very wide umbrella for American anti-communists to gather under. The admonition to those who wanted to be considered 100% American and to be part of the resistance to communism wasn't to embrace a specific religion. It was just to go to the worship gathering of your choice every week. Any gathering, as long as the people believed in a creator God. You may remember the story of Conrad Hilton from an earlier video. Here's a 1952 ad that was in Life magazine, created by Conrad Hilton for his Hilton hotels. But the ad's content isn't about the amenities of Conrad's hotels. It is a prayer, introducing the prayer as a comment, likely by Hilton himself, declaring, "America on its knees, not beaten there by the hammer and sickle, but freely, intelligently, responsibly, confidently, powerfully. America now knows it can destroy communism and win the battle for peace. We need fear nothing or no one except God." Yes, Hilton's ads at this time period evidently often included prayers. His conviction that religious faith was a critical part of America's battle against communism was well publicized. In 1956, an article in the trade magazine Sales Management, the Magazine of Marketing, noted, "The recent rise of Hilton International has coincided with Conrad Hilton's personal fight against communism." Indeed, Conrad Hilton regularly substituted prayers for advertisements. Hilton was a passionate Catholic. He also had respect for other religions, working closely with Jews and Muslims. Notice that Hilton was satisfied with anyone who claimed a belief in a creator God, including Muslims and Jews, and just about any Protestant. But notice where he drew the line. He abominated atheists and demonized communists. And Conrad wasn't the only one who put up a wide umbrella. Listen to the words of Dwight Eisenhower on December 22, 1952, speaking extemporaneously. He was sharing his conviction that the American form of government since 1776 was based on Judeo-Christian moral values. And this is how they, the Founding Fathers in 1776, explained those. "We hold that all men are endowed by their Creator, not by the accident of their birth, not by the color of their skins, or by anything else, but all men are endowed by their Creator." In other words, our form of government has no sense unless it is founded in a deeply felt religious faith. And I don't care what it is. With us, of course, it's the Judeo-Christian concept, but it must be a religion with all men are created equal. Why on earth would all these people over the years, including Dwight Eisenhower, care so much whether some American believed in a supernatural God or not? As the old saying goes, what does that have to do with the price of tea in China? I think I have a partial answer to that. You see, one of the most significant parts of the standard Great American History narrative is the concept of the new nation of America back at the beginning having a manifest destiny. as symbolically portrayed in this iconic painting from 1872. And what was that manifest destiny? To spread across the whole continent and subdue it, spreading both democracy and capitalism from sea to shining sea. This term is often referred to as the doctrine of manifest destiny, a decidedly religious notion. It implies that this expansion and all its evil side effects, such as the near extinction of the Native Americans, was both justified and inevitable. If you've not heard much about this doctrine before, here's a brief explanation from the History Channel website. By the time Texas was admitted to the Union as a state in December 1845, the idea that the United States must inevitably expand westward all the way to the Pacific Ocean had taken firm hold among people from different regions, classes, and political persuasions. The phrase manifest destiny, which emerged as the best known expression of this mindset, first appeared in an editorial published in the July-August 1845 issue of the Democratic Review. In it, the writer criticized the opposition that still lingered against the annexation of Texas, urging national unity on behalf of, quote, the fulfillment of our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions, unquote. As the phrase also appeared in a nearly identical context in a July 1845 article in the New York Morning News, its originator is believed to be John O'Sullivan, the editor of both the Democratic Review and the Morning News at the time. That December, another Morning News article mentioned manifest destiny in reference to the Oregon Territory, another new frontier over which the United States was eager to assert its dominion. In case you're not used to it, the term providence used by the Democratic Review writer refers to the foreseeing care and guidance of God. In other words, to be a 100% American by the definition of super patriots, both in the past and now, you have to believe in manifest destiny. And to do that, you have to believe in a supernatural creator God. In fact, if you don't believe in such a being, many folks have a terrible time understanding how you can believe that people all ought to be treated equally, since you don't believe they were made that way by God. Nor can they understand how you can believe everyone should be free, since they are totally sure freedom is an endowment by God. At this point, of course, the logic all begins to break down, because from the very beginning, when this God was supposed to be so self-evident and supposed to have endowed everyone with freedom and equality, the signers of the Declaration totally ignored the endowments of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that slaves and Native Americans were due from this self-evident creator. In the long run, most of the theories about how America could be saved from communism by a resurgence of belief in God were riddled with illogical assumptions. But that didn't stop intelligent, educated men and women from believing them and getting on board the schemes. And it didn't stop them from insisting that they weren't going against the First Amendment guarantee of freedom of religion. They didn't care if you were a Baptist, or Catholic, or Pentecostal, or Jew, or maybe even a Muslim. They didn't try to impose a set of rules on your daily life, didn't try to get you to agree about details about heaven, hell, purgatory, or the Trinity. They were fully convinced that you had freedom under the Constitution to join any church or synagogue, to keep any religious customs you wanted. They didn't even think that the Declaration or Constitution required you to believe in a creator God. They just thought that belief in God was self-evident. And so I'm guessing that most people assumed any guy who claimed to not believe in a creator God was either stupid or evil, and definitely couldn't be trusted around your wife, because everyone knows atheists believe in free love and have no sense of guilt about disobeying one of the 10 Commandments, the one about adultery, since they don't believe in the God who gave those commandments. Of course, now we are back to the illogical world, since statistics have long shown that adultery and other sexual sins have been just as rampant inside religious groups over the years as outside, including groups that post the Ten Commandments on their Sunday school walls. Up through the 1930s, an apt analogy for the communist threat was the ogre. Ogres like to rampage and destroy and eat people, particularly little children. The U.S. government and other American leaders literally encouraged the citizenry of the country to be ready to come against this threat head-on, meeting violence with violence, even if necessary. But by the late 1940s, the analogy shifted. Communism became viewed as not wanting to devour your children. It was portrayed as wanting to seduce and transform your children into a creature like itself. We had better stop smiling. There is a conspiracy. The conspiracy against the American way of life, against everything that we hold dear, is probably the most completely organized, ruthless design against other people ever set in motion in all human history. The infiltration and control of American education became communism's #1 objective in America. They want the children of America. They want your child. So you might say that the analogy shifted from Frankenstein's monster to another familiar movie character, Dracula. Dracula was portrayed as a vampire, a half-human creature who could turn people into vampires if he could sneak up on them while they were asleep, or seduce them through hypnosis into letting him suck their blood. If he came for you, you didn't rush at him with pitchfork or torch. He wasn't just a mindless monster. He was a pure anti-God evil being. So you fought that kind of fire with your kind of fire as a godly person. Yes, real vampire slayers like Van Helsing here knew Drac was stopped in his tracks by a cross. And that was the idea of the anti-communist movement organizations of the 1940s on. You protected yourself and your children from the communist menace by beefing up your spirituality and belief in God. Communism was not bent on destroying your children. It was bent on seducing them and turning them into godless communists. And one of the main battlefields of the time, where you ought to come against this effort, was viewed as the American educational system. Here's another booklet from about 1949 by the same author as They Want Your Child. Progressive education increases delinquency. The tragic and terrifying thing about all this is that it represents not merely rebellion against a moral code, but denial that there can be any binding moral code. It is a fundamental revolution in human thinking of the first order. It is mental and ethical nihilism. If it goes on unchecked, it will mean not merely tragedy for millions of individuals, it will mean the disintegration and final extinction of the American society. Perhaps many people watching this video will think this is all quaint, ancient history. All that was over 60 years ago in the mid-20th century. We are in the enlightened 21st century now, many assume. They may think only a small subculture of hardcore conservative fundamentalists have these concerns now. Think again. John Follis, the author of a January 2019 article on the Pathos website titled The True Story Behind America's Demonization of Atheism, shared some observations I'm shortly going to show on screen. I was startled to read this article recently because it echoed things I'd already put in episodes of this Strange Brew series, both in an earlier written version on my blog and in these videos. As a matter of fact, I stumbled on the article while looking for a copy of the Religion in American Life poster that I had used in an episode of the series on that topic. At the end of this article, author Follis included a citation to that Strange Brew episode of my blog from March 2017 that he had used as part of his own research. Here's what Follis wrote. If you ask Americans to list the most negative labels to give someone, atheist would probably be on that list. Growing up, the message I got was that being an atheist is akin to being amoral and un-American. Sunday school made it clear that atheists were bad, godless people. If you grew up in the 50s or 60s, you didn't need Sunday school to be taught to hate atheists, because in the early 50s, the American government initiated a massive multi-pronged campaign to demonize atheism, and it worked well. The 1950s were the height of the Cold War, when the omnipresent threat to America was communism. As the fear of communism in the Soviet Union grew stronger, President Eisenhower felt the need to do something big to help unify and calm the country. At the encouragement of various ministers, religious politicians, business leaders, and his influential evangelist pal Billy Graham, Eisenhower agreed on a bold strategy: demonize communism by demonizing a main tenet of communism, atheism. The idea was to make the U.S. versus Soviet Union a holy war and draft God as America's #1 commie fighter. To facilitate that, Eisenhower took aggressive executive action. First, he got Congress to add "one nation under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance, a pledge recited daily in every classroom in America. Then he got Congress to replace "E pluribus unum," the U.S. motto since 1782, meaning "out of many, one," with "in God we trust." After that, he got Congress to approve posting "in God we trust" in courtrooms, government buildings, public schools, on postage stamps, and on all U.S. currency. Even some comic books of the day talked about godless communism. And New York State created a school prayer specifically designed to counter the spread of communism. As if all that wasn't enough, the administration teamed up with the Advertising Council, major religious institutions, and corporate America to create something called the Religion in American Life campaign. With an annual budget of $200,000, over $2 million in today's dollars, the campaign goal was to encourage Americans to attend church. It was a well-coordinated, unified effort that in 1956 alone included 5,412 highway billboards, 9,857 bus, train, and railroad station posters, and 59,590 ad cards inside buses, trains, subways, and streetcars. In addition, movie theaters ran public service announcements imploring the public to attend the church of your choice next Sunday. It's fair to say that during the 1950s, nothing in America was marketed better than God, and nothing was demonized more than communism and atheism. And what was Follis's conclusion of the matter? Evidently, the end of the Cold War and the passing of 60 years has not softened Americans' attitude toward atheists. According to a 2016 University of Minnesota study, the Americans have actually sharpened their negative views. It showed that atheists are still perceived as cultural outsiders who, quote, have rejected cultural values and practices understood as essential to private morality, civic virtue, and national identity. They were chosen, quote, the most disliked religious minority, unquote, in the U.S. Clearly, Eisenhower and company embedded an anti-atheist cultural bias that still remains strong today. We will explore more of the ways in which the groundwork was laid in the 1950s and 60s to underpin attitudes that have remained deeply embedded in American society clear up to today in the next episode in this series. Better dead than red.